Thank you, Professor Nussbaum, for this comprehensive talk. So let's start the Q&A session. So is there any question? Yeah, please.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. So I have one question. I was thinking about whether we can distinguish between two kinds of anger. First is anger directed at particular wrongdoers as responsible moral agents. And the other one is anger directed as the underlying systemic causes that enables, facilitates, or even necessitates the wrongdoing. So the agent-oriented anger and the system-oriented anger. And I was wondering whether, even though the first kind of anger does not have place in the transition, the second kind of anger might still be essential to revolutionary justice. So for example, Black Lives Matter activists may be angry at the rigged criminal justice system without being angry at the particular cops who killed young African American. And in a newly formed democracy that just transitioned from authoritarianism, the people might be angry, still be angry at the dominant party who ruled in the authoritarian regime and wanted to permanently ban that organization without being angry at the particular officials and want to just punish them, right? So, so we can retain the second kind of anger without having the first kind of anger. So.
Well, you know, I do talk about this in the book, so you can see at greater length what I say there. Of course, there is that kind of anger. But again, there are two different things that one might do. One is to say how outrageous this system is. Let's see what we can do about that. So that's transition anger. And that's what I think is usually very, very helpful. But if one's thinking in terms of payback, and it's very hard sometimes to separate these two ways of thinking, you always hear people saying, let's blow up the system. Let's smash the military-industrial complex, right? And the Occupy movement, the Bernie Sanders movement, all these contain mixtures of the two. And of course, sometimes the status thing gets into it too. Let's, bring them low and so on. And so I think it's crucial to separate those two things. And it's very hard to do that. I think in the history of political thought, you have that sort of noxious admixture of wanting constructive, forward-looking thought about systemic change with the tendency to blow it all up. I'll tell you a funny thing, which is that we have a new production of Wagner's Ring opening in Chicago. And of course, Wagner had the attitude, the whole system's corrupt, let's blow it up. And that's, and of course it's very nihilistic, and it deliberately so, given his reading of Schopenhauer. The great singer who's about to play Wotan in that production, Eric Owens, was a guest in my opera class, and he was talking, he's an African-American from the south side of Chicago, great singer. He was talking about the Ring and his understanding of it, and he related it to the criminal justice problems in the city of Chicago. And he says, Wagner's right, you gotta blow the whole thing up, and then maybe we'll start something again, right? See, that's the payback, right? And that, I think, is not particularly helpful. So then the question is to tease that apart from this other more constructive one that says, yeah, this is really outrageous, but then let's try to figure out how to fix it. And I think often when people feel helpless and they can't see how to fix it, then they veer over to the other one. But because, of course, it is terribly hard to fix it.
Please.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but the first point, given that you mentioned Wagner, is I don't think Wagner promote destruction, but more dissolution, dissolving the sublime. So sorry, just this point. I want to challenge you on the philosophical ground, because you gave an interpretation, for example, of the Greek tragedy. And for instance, I disagree on the idea, on a certain interpretation of how the Furii were transformed. I think that their transformation in a human figure is because the Greeks understood that anger is part of human nature. So it is sort of reappropriated and managed within a certain system. And the other question is whether you think that from the Greek system that was divided in private, public, and religion, so that there were three spaces, not only two as we have today. Law has replaced religion, or is trying to replace religion. And indeed, Hegel thought that the law was the space of freedom in a dialectical way. And the third and last question is, how would you qualitatively distinguish your idea from an eschatological Hegelian idea of negative dialectics? So even through the worst events, you manage to get the good. Thank you.
Okay, well, I won't answer the third part because I don't understand Hegel. But, look, the talk used a certain example from Greek tragedy. We could argue it if we had the text. It would be easier to show the many references to the welfare of the city that suffuse that text and are connected to the altered demeanor. But, for the purposes of my argument, it doesn't matter. If I made it up, it would be the same lecture, right? I could give you a fictional example just as well and write my own play. So I don't think it really is pertinent to the lecture as such, but I do believe that I'm correct about Aeschylus. As for the second part being the question about private, public, and religion, I think it's a mistake to put it quite that way, because Greek religion was very multiform, very protean. It suffused every part of life. There was religion of the family, there's religion of the city. And so what we're dealing with in a situation like the Antigone is not the clash of religion and the state. Of course, Hegel anachronistically uses it to represent that, but I think knowing, of course, that that's not really what the Greeks were thinking. The Greeks, of course, thought the state was the site of crucial parts of their religion. And indeed, Antigone is said to stumble against the altar of Athena, guardian of the city. So religion is everywhere, and then the clash is between some parts of it and other parts. And of course, that's what polytheism is. It's a system in which the gods contest, and they don't all agree. But I think I'll stop there. I think this one isn't working very well, so maybe I'll stay here.
I totally understand your antipathy towards anger in the public domain and the destructive effects of anger, but I wondered about your characterization of anger as senseless. Actually, but by definition senseless in some way, because I'm not even sure whether sense and senselessness is the right thing, the right terminology to ascribe to, characterizing the emotions. I mean, surely sometimes anger is unreasonable. Maybe there's anger is senseless when it's misplaced anger, because it literally is out of connection, out of touch with its object, mischaracterizes its object. But wouldn't we really want to think of anger as being in terms of whether it's reasonable or justified anger or not, rather than having sense or being senseless? And surely sometimes anger is justified and sometimes it's not.
Well, I've taken it apart into various constituent beliefs, and I can certainly grant, and indeed it's a prominent part of my argument, that sometimes anger is what I would call well-grounded, and you'll see why I use that word rather than the word justified. If you're correct about the fact that there was damage, the damage was significant, you're right about who did it, and that it was wrongfully inflicted. Okay, so that's well-grounded. It's the payback wish that you, in addition, hope to, by a kind of payback process, to improve your situation. That's the part that I'm zeroing in on, and I'm saying that's always empty. It's an empty thought that shedding that person's blood restores the blood that they shed. Now, of course, even then, I've granted that anger may be instrumentally useful. But I think it's never fully justified if we include in it that payback wish. So it's only the form that lacks that, the form that I call transition anger, that I would ever say is fully justified. So I would say like 3 out of the 4 beliefs that the other anger contains are fine. but this last one, the payback one, is not so fine. Because it is, I mean, I think it's deeply human to think, oh, somehow punishing my betraying spouse by a punitive divorce litigation somehow improves my lot or balances out my pain or something. But it's a, you know, if you take it apart and look at it, what actually it doesn't. I mean, what would be good is a complicated question, and then we have to answer that question. But usually people think, oh, blood for blood, pain for pain, I'll inflict some pain on him and then I'll be a lot better. And it's that automatic, reflexive, very human, and I think evolutionary form of the payback wish that I want to zero in on. So I don't think you and I are totally disagreeing, because I do have room for the concept of anger being well grounded. It's just that we have to lop off that payback part, and then it becomes transition anger, and we have to think, well, what must be done then? Something must be done about that, but then what would that be? That I should say that my transition anger is what Jean Hampton calls indignation. I just don't use the word indignation because I think in common parlance it's used many different ways, and she uses it as a technical term, but I'd rather have a word that's obviously a technical term so we don't get confused about how it's being used.
Or if I can make a comment, presumably the payback, or what you call payback, or maybe just recompense, is the rationality involved in that is simply that if recompense is given, the anger abates, or anger is assuaged. So that now what assuages anger, or what is proportional to the assuagement of anger, may be an issue, you know, and there may be unreasonable claims for recompense or unreasonable claims for payback. But I don't know why recompense, the idea of recompense in relation to anger, there's something intrinsically wrong with it. It's just what human beings, what anger is. You know, that anger is an emotion that, as you suggest, requires recompense in order to be assuaged. Otherwise, one feels angry because one hasn't achieved justice. And what all the methods that you describe could be seen as attenuated methods, or of assuaging that anger. And we might be very sophisticated in our ways of dealing with it, as in the cases of non-violence that you talk about, which are great, but in a sense that they can also be seen as very sophisticated ways of assuaging anger.
You've moved your ground from the initial damage, which was something like a murder or an assault, to your feelings. Well, maybe people can feel better when they inflict pain on other people. I certainly grant you that. And that we know, by the way, how highly malleable that is. In the last 20 years, Americans have come to feel that unless they stand up in court and they demand a harsh sentence for the criminal, so-called victim impact statements, they will never have closure. And this idea of closure has a date. I mean, it never was heard before something like 1990. But now everyone thinks, and no doubt sincerely feels, that they will never rest unless they get up and make this statement. So, you know, those feelings of what will satisfy you are highly malleable and volatile and often quite sadistic. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the real well-being problem. Someone was murdered, your marriage has been ended, whatever the problem originally was. Now let's talk about the marriage. I mean, I have a whole chapter on marriages and things like that. Yeah, of course, people feel helpless when somebody betrays them and a marriage of 35 years has ended. We all know many people to whom that's happened. And the real problem is some deeply valuable thing has ended, and we don't know what to do going forward. Then the fantasy develops, oh, if I only inflict pain on that absent ex, then I'll have a new life. But of course you don't. You have the old life, only in a very diseased form. You never form new friends. In fact, your old friends don't like you because you're obsessed with revenge. You never learn how to go to a concert by yourself, and so on. And we all know people for whom it's much easier to retain that relationship with the ex than to form a new life. But so they might really feel better. I don't deny that to you, but I'm saying the real problem, the well-being problem, has not been solved.
Hi. On a practical matter, we see that modern media and discussions and all that is easily steered towards a payback kind of mindset. And historically, there aren't a lot of successful leaders who really manage to bring the transformation process to the masses. Yeah. So with everyone being their own author and publisher and online discussion devolving into hate speech more often than not, what does it mean going forward when everyone is bombarded with messages and most of them are luring us towards a more destructive resolution methods?
It's a very hard thing in American politics. If you remember Michael Dukakis, a candidate for president he had been, as governor of Massachusetts, he had a program to early parole for certain prisoners. One of the prisoners named Willie Horton, had raped a woman. And so they asked him on national TV, how would you feel if Willie Horton raped your wife? And Dukakis, being a man of reason, I think also being a man of privacy, he said, well, I don't know whether one case would cause me to rethink the whole policy. I'd have to see, and, So that was the wrong answer. He should have said, I would kill him. And then I think that more than any single thing, lost him the election. It's pretty amazing that King had the enormous influence he did, and I think that was because he had a rhetorical and religious tradition that he was coming from. And I do think that the evangelical churches have been the source of some of the best responses to anger in public. I talk about the Dylan Roof murders in South Carolina, where all the people in that church, they said, well, I do, one person said, I feel anger, but I know I'm a work in progress. But they all expressed the attempt, anyway, to offer forgiveness. So I think we have traditions we can draw on, but boy, in today's politics, you're quite right, we don't see this. And I think the Trump movement, my book was not timed to coincide with Trumpism, but it did. And so I get asked about this all the time. I think, what I say in the book is that anger is often the deflection of helplessness. Because if you feel helpless, then it's easier to seize control and to say, oh, you're to blame. Like if your mother dies in the hospital, I'll sue the doctors, instead of mourning the loss. And I think the followers of Trump are people who, for good reason, feel helpless. Their jobs have vanished. Jobs in manufacturing have gone. The new people have come into the workforce, women, minorities, immigrants. And so instead of figuring out, and no one knows quite how to solve the employment problems and health problems of white men in America, which are staggering all of a sudden, the drug problems and so on. And so, it's not surprising that those people themselves don't know how to solve the problem. So they react with anger and will blame it on the immigrants, will blame it on women, and so on. So I think it's very tough. And what we really need is a leader who can model non-anger in a way that doesn't come across as elitist or academic. I'm the worst person to talk about this, of course, because, first I'm a woman, and women are puny and they take anything, but also I come across as elitist and academic. Obama, I have to say, he tries hard to exemplify a spirit of reconciliation, deliberation, non-anger, but he comes across as cold and elitist. And so I don't know, what the right thing, each country has to do it in its own way. Now, Gandhi was so clever because he figured out that for a Hindu man to do this, he has to tap into the tradition of the sannyasi. So he changes his body, he changes his shape, he changes his clothing, and so forth. Of course, if King had just done that, it would have been a grotesque failure. But King had to figure out how, while being clearly virile and manly, and I'm sure that he wanted to have love affairs anyway, but it wasn't a bad thing for his success that he did, J. Edgar Hoover notwithstanding. I think that he was known to be a manly man was good for his success. And then he modeled in his own way the spirit of love that Gandhi was talking about. But, and Mandela, a different culture again, and not accidental that he was a son of a chief, that he had that royal heritage, and he could exemplify kind of strength of a kingly kind. So each person who's trying to do this has to figure out what their own strategy is going to be, but it's especially hard in America. So just one more reference to Hamilton, because I'm writing something about the musical. Alexander Hamilton did not want to be a man who fought duels for the sake of honor. He had learned by a certain stage that was a kind of bankrupt course. But he also understood that in his culture, if you don't engage in that competition for honors, then you can't do anything. And the letter he writes when he's about to go off to his end, accepting Burr's challenge, says, this is the culture we're in, the culture of honor. And if I don't get into that, I won't be able to do anything fine in politics. So then he dies. So I don't know, it's a very hard problem to solve. George Washington was the only one who could kind of stay aloof from that, but that was because he was so physically powerful and he was a military hero and so forth. So, sort of Mandela type character. So I don't have any recommendation for politicians in America except to just try to solve the problem in their own way. And we have a candidate for Senate now in Illinois who is, I think, a good example of solving it in her own way. She has a resolutely cheerful and non-angry stance, but she was a pilot in the Iraq War, and she lost both of her legs in a helicopter accident. So she comes up there with her two prostheses painted red, white, and blue, and she speaks in a very cheerful and upbeat way. But she, the toughness is exemplified by her body, in just the fact that she obviously was very courageous and lost her legs. So anyway, each one has to figure it out.
Hi there.
Hi, I'm Cherian George from Baptist University next door. Thanks very much for the presentation, Prof. Nussbaum. This actually follows on nicely from your previous answer. In today's presentation, you applied reason to the emotion of anger. In your earlier book on religious intolerance, you did the same with fear. My question, I guess, is more meta, which is what is the role of reason in public life? There are many commentators who say that we are entering this, or we've entered this age of unreason, and perhaps Donald Trump is its patron saint. Leave aside reason, that it seems that even facts don't have the cachet that they're supposed to. Would you agree with that assessment, that we seem to be in an unusually bleak period in terms of the status of reason? And if so, what is the solution? I mean, your remarks in reply to the previous question were in a way discouraging for the status of reason, because the solutions that you suggested seem to boil down to charismatic leadership more than reason. It is about having a leader with the right moral authority, for example, rather than necessarily the best arguments. So I wonder if you could comment lastly on that.
That was true in those cases, but don't forget I also used the South Carolina example of people who are following a King-like course. I do think that King, more than the others, has been able to transmit to many, many people on a very broad basis his philosophy in such a way that people learn it in their churches, they exemplify it. I think it's the role of the churches, really. I mean, as Kant said, we need a church to solidify our commitment to the moral law. Well, I mean, in this case, I think the fact that there is an organization, namely the black churches, that teach King's message and teach it as a response to things that are very anger-producing, that helps. Whereas in India, for complicated reasons having to do with Nehru's dislike of religion, there was no attempt to get liberal religion to play a role. So religion was left to the ultra-right. And Nehru just thought, oh, well, it's all going to be economics from now on, no need for religion. So I think liberal religion plays a huge role in getting people to carry this forward. Otherwise we would have to rely on charismatic leadership in each case, which we don't want. But yes, I think the very sharp turn away from reason. I mean, as an educator, I talk about the importance of keeping liberal education going in the schools and in the universities and so on. And I feel pretty confident that that's not going too badly, at least in the United States, that there is still a commitment to argument and to liberal education. But there's an increasing gulf between all of that and the reality of the political culture. And I think you see it most especially on the right, because in our law school, we deliberately want a broad political spectrum on the faculty because we have a broad political spectrum in the student body. So we have two people who might be called right, but and I teach with one of them, that is Will Bode, who's a wonderful, brilliant academic, but he's a person of reason. And, he and I agree about how to face these questions. And then we taught a seminar together on public morality and legal conservatism that was, I think, just very uplifting and satisfying because it was a model of how you can face these politically divisive questions about sex laws and drug laws and so on through reason. But what relation does that have to the larger political culture? It might have a little relation to what those students will do when they go clerk for judges, et cetera. I hope so. But, the rest of American culture, it is very tough. I think we have to keep trying. I think on sexual orientation, philosophical good work has made a difference. I think John Corvino, a philosopher who writes very engagingly about sexual orientation, but then goes out and with an equally engaging and reasonable and so on Baptist minister has public debates about these things. He's done great good for the public culture. So I think we have to keep trying to do this and do more and more of it, but it is quite alarming how even science is being held in disregard, and this whole global warming thing. Like 5 years ago, most Republicans took climate science very seriously, but now all of a sudden, no one on the Republican Party does. So I agree that it's a very worrisome trend. I think it's not just in the United States that you see it. I also see it in India, where I do a lot of work, where the Hindu right is also very anti-science. But anyway, yeah, I'm worried about that.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. Professor, you mentioned you take Kim, Mandela, and Gandhi as examples who successfully transformed their anger into a constructive emotion instead of a destructive one. But Mandela and King, both Mandela and King were Christians, and Gandhi were a Hinduist. So
Mandela was not a Christian. Well, he followed traditional African religion,
Yeah.
but not Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, all three have their religious background. So there might be a possibility that it was their experience of spiritual exercise instead of reason that helped them to channel their emotion. So my question is, do you think it is possible for an atheist to channel her anger?
Well, first of all, Mandela was not a religious person, and the spiritual exercises that he followed were those recommended by the ancient Greek and Roman Stoics, which, I mean, the Stoics did think that you shouldn't just think that a one-shot argument will divest you of years of habit. The thinking involved has to become habitual. So that means you have to engage in self-habituation. But that didn't have to be against any particular metaphysical background, and that's why the Stoic view was able to influence Mandela, coming from such a totally different culture. In fact, the reason that I like the example of Mandela and give him such a central place is precisely that he doesn't attach it to any religious metaphysics. So he shows that you can do it without religious metaphysics. Now, Gandhi didn't really either, in the sense that Hinduism was whatever he said it was. I mean, he just redefined it so radically. He defined Hinduism as the pursuit of truth by nonviolent means. Now, you know, of course, Hinduism being very protean, you could find anything in the scriptures, but that would not be one of the first things that would occur to one. But he reshaped it. So I would say the non-anger comes first, and then the reshaping of religion follows. Let me just add that Gandhi did this with all the emotions. Richard Sorabji's excellent book, Gandhi and the Stoics, shows that Gandhi really went the whole hog and got rid of grief, passionate love, fear, all of those emotions. That I don't recommend. So my view is all about anger, and so I think, again, Mandela is a better example because he's perfectly clear that he's a person of intense grief, intense anxiety for his loved ones, and passionate love. So all of those emotions he kept. But in any case, I think we always need to work on ourselves. And when that woman in South Carolina said, "I'm a work in progress," she meant, I'm trying hard to get rid of my anger, but I haven't gotten far enough. And I say that about myself in the book, where I note that my own particular weak point where anger is concerned are the minutiae of daily life, where you have some bad Comcast tech who doesn't fix your internet, or you're on a plane with rude people who do things that are annoying and so on. And, you know, I think I don't work hard enough on myself to get on top of that, partly because I think it's not very important anyway, but then that boomerangs, because then thinking it's not so important, I don't do the work that would get me to the point where I see that it's not worth getting upset about. So anyway, I think we all have our own pet zones of anger in the intimate realm, or the daily life realm, or the political realm. And it's just a question of trying to work on oneself. And what I think the Greek and Roman philosophers all understood very well is that philosophy is a kind of treatment of the soul. It's not just about understanding an argument, but it's about making it internal and making it inhabit you.
Okay, so we have time for 2 or 3 questions. So let's start here.
There's no question that
I think that one is running out. It's getting dead. It's a battery. Well, wait a minute. Why don't I give you this one, which still works, and then I can use the podium. I think it's probably just needs recharging.
Thank you. There's no question that anger and resentment can be toxic, that they can become maliciously punitive, that they can mainly take the form of payback. But I I want to try out a suggestion that there are forms of reasonable anger and resentment that have much wider place in moral and political life than it sounded like you were willing to accommodate for them. And also that there may be occasions morally and politically when the use of force is the right thing without it simply being payback. But just to sort of fill this out a bit without taking too long, it seems to me that, that anger and resentment can be ways of taking seriously the evil or the harm or the injury or the injustice that's been done, where the concern is not with payback, but with the standing or the rights and the welfare of those who have been injured by the wrong or by the injustice. So if we imagine a society in which no one feels indignation on behalf of anyone else, and everybody looks at an injury or an injustice as sort of an opportunity to try to repair things, politically, I think that's a terrifying prospect. And morally, it strikes me as a sort of incomplete appreciation of the reality of the situation. In other words, it's true that sometimes anger takes the form of payback out of a feeling of helplessness, but at the same time, we don't want to become distracted from the reality of the evil or the injustice.
Well, I think you and I are really in agreement in the sense that accountability is a big part of my political vision, and that's why transition anger, which says this is wrong, this is outrageous, it must not happen again, it starts with this is outrageous. But then, rather than saying, and I'm going to give you pain for pain, it turns to the future. So I think everything that you've said, at least I would hope so, can be got in a system that says these are inalienable rights, we must protect them, we must vindicate them if they've been violated, but just does away with this diversion of the pain for pain stuff. So I certainly think that we don't want a society in which no one got exercised at a wrongdoing, but that's not what I'm proposing. I'm proposing that when there's wrongdoing, we say, this is outrageous, it must not happen again, and then we get to work figuring out how to really make it not happen again, which is not, it could include inflicting pain on the wrongdoer, probably would, but it would, I think much more, it would include a lot more than that.
The strategies and the attitudes that are appropriate for social policy are not exactly the same as those that are appropriate for criminal justice, let's say. That's where I feel some concern about distraction. Well, we can talk about that in the conference tomorrow, and you can see what you think about that. But I guess I think there's no walk of life in which the thought of payback as such is anything but a harmful red herring. Now, criminal justice, that doesn't mean that we don't want prisons, although the kind we have now, we don't want those. But my first point is what's outrageous, what ought to first be the object of our outrage in that area is that so many people grow up with no alternative in life but crime. So if we really thought about the whole problem of crime, then we would think, well, how do we produce children who are nourished, who are educated, who have employment opportunities, who are loved, and, on plausible assumptions about human nature, which I think, unfortunately, most Americans don't have. I think they do think that African Americans are a criminal race or something. But on plausible assumptions about human nature, we would all, if we did all those things, good nutrition, good education, good housing, and so then we would have much less crime to deal with. Then when we do have that, okay, then we have to think what's the best way to deal with that. And it's not going to be a country club except for Nelson Mandela. but it's also not going to violate basic human dignity, I would hope. And then we have to look empirically about the different effects of different kinds of treatment on recidivism and so on. And you know, what's so clear is that Americans think that way when it's white people. So all of a sudden, now that the drug problem has massively shifted from other drug offenses to prescription drug addiction and heroin addiction, and the perpetrators are primarily white, all of a sudden people are saying, well, now let's get them into treatment programs. And yeah, but why didn't we think that before? Because of hatred, and that's what I'm against. Yeah.
Okay, last two questions. Yeah, please.
Okay. Pass this back.
Thanks for the lecture. So I have a related question about anger or payback. According to you adopt Aristotle's notion of anger, according to which anger must involve payback. I'm not sure, but I grant that because I'm not a native English speaker. So, but neither is Aristotle. So. But anyhow, let's grant that anger must involve the element of payback. But according to my understanding, to want the wrongdoer to pay back is to want the wrongdoer to be punished. But punishment is different from retribution. Retributivism is just one theory of punishment. So the retribution could be a possible reason to justify punishment. Maybe false, but punishment could still be justified on other grounds.
Oh, sure. That's what I've said from the very beginning. Yeah.
Okay. Oh,
I mean, the thing is, we didn't really, none of the Greek philosophers wanted retributive punishment. But they all wanted some punishment, and they basically had various kinds of consequentialist or deterrent theories of different types.
Yeah.
I think, where retributivism got its ascendancy, unfortunately, is through the Judeo-Christian tradition and the idea that of a punitive, retributive God, which, of course, in my view, is an incorrect idea of God, but in any case, a lot of people have it. But no, of course, you might have punishment for lots of reasons. Reform, we could also talk about.
Yeah, but my point is, I think anger only involves punishment, not retribution. So if punishment could be justified, anger involving payback could still be justified. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, that is certainly not what the Western philosophical tradition thinks, because they think that it's a conceptual matter that this perp gets payback. Now, of course, if you have a deterrent view, it's not a conceptual matter at all. You have to do the empirics, and you have to ask, how would a given treatment promote incapacitation, specific deterrence, general deterrence, and then if you throw reform into the mix, it gets yet more complicated. But the emotion itself would be hard to harness to that very complicated empirical program, and that is not what people think, although there might be philosophical traditions in which there's an emotion that embraces all of that, but I guess if I found one, I would bet that it would be very like my transition anger, because it's committed to a forward-looking search for sensible strategies, which is really what deterrence, specific and general, is all about. I grant you, by the way, that words are tricky. I think in the Western philosophical tradition, there's a tendency for all the writers to be reading each other and translating each other so that the different terms in the different languages get kind of pulled toward each other, but it's not too easy even so. I'm dealing now with the German translator of my book, and we've agreed that it's not easy because there's no single German word that, English has anger and angry, but you have Zorn, but you can't say ich bin zornig. I mean, if you did, it would seem very extreme. But so there, anyway, so German poses many problems. There's Wut and Wutend, and then there's Ich bin böse. So, yeah, we have a lot of difficulty, but I think that in the philosophical texts, it's not so much difficulty because they're all kind of translating each other.
Okay, let's ask the last question, if any. Yeah, please. Yeah, lady. No, lady.
Thank you. I just have a question about the process of detaching the deed from the doer as the third path that you could take. So the first two paths that you've described are very much, to my understanding, self-centric. So the idea of that something's done to you, and so you can balance it out. You're on one side of the scale, and somebody else is on the other side. And then the idea of the relative status, so it's very much me-centric. And the third seems to be more, the one that you recommend, seems to be more removing yourself from anger, from transitioning yourself from the sort of like primacy of anger. And so in that process of removing the deed from the doer, is there also an element of removing the subject from the event or what have you?
Well, I think it's certainly free from a certain kind of doomed or pernicious egocentrism, but it depends, I think, on the case, because if the case is the divorce situation, where the problem is you've just lost your whole life, then it would be right for you to think about you going forward, like, how shall I have a life? How shall I have new friends? How shall I have new activities, and so on and so on. And so separating the deed from the doer might be part of that. I think that's so to the extent that you have to deal with the same people. So in the political case, we're talking about the separating the deed from the doer because we're in a situation where we know we have to deal with the very same people who inflicted great damage upon us. We have to go on dealing with them. So that's where King and Mandela introduced the idea of separating the deed from the doer, because if you want to see them as people you can work with, then you better do that. You better think, well, they did a bad thing, but they're not unalterably evil. In the personal divorce situation, you might just want not to see that person again, and that would be fine. So you wouldn't have to go through this exercise of saying, well, now I'll try to separate the deed from the doer. If you, on the other hand, if you have a troubled marriage and you want to save it, that might be a good thing to do. Just not thinking that's the evil person, but thinking, well, that was a pretty bad way of handling this problem, but let's see what more you could be capable of.
Right, so the quick follow-up question would be, are there cases wherein, for example, in everyday justice, like you mentioned, or in the divorce situation wherein it's not natural for me, the best thing for me to being is to be angry? Does it have to end up in that third sort of reconciliatory path that you recommend?
Well, I mean, natural is tricky, right? Because we all have childhoods and we learn our emotions in a culture. And I did say that I think retaliatory anger has an evolutionary origin. That's a guess. But how do I know, right? Because we don't ever observe it free from culture. We know that even very small infants have emotions ascribed to their crying behavior in accordance with the culture's views of gender and so on. So like there's this one experiment where a baby is crying and the subject of the experiment is told, oh, would you please hold her for me? Or sometimes, would you hold him for me? And it's the same baby, the same crying. If they think it's a little girl, they'll label the emotion as fear. If they think it's a little boy, they'll label the emotion as anger. Well, so you can see that if they were really bringing up that child, that there would be all kinds of things put up upon that little child that would shape that child's emotions long before they could even speak. And so I don't think we ever know really what's natural. It would be nice to know, but I think we I think it's like what Nil says in The Subjection of Women. We haven't got to the point where we can say what gender is, but in general with the emotions, I think that's true because they're so cultural. So all we can say is that as we find ourselves, we find it very easy to feel anger. And I think there's great variation there. Some people find it easier than other people, obviously. And so to the extent that we find ourselves feeling angry and we think that that's stupid, then we can work on ourselves. But as I say, it's not a one-shot argument we need. It's a kind of, because it was formed through habit, then it has to be reformed through habit. So if every time I'm on the phone with Comcast, I take deep breaths and I do meditative exercises, right? And I think, oh, don't get so upset. This is not very important. Then, I think if I practiced that often enough, I probably would be less angry. I think one of the problems with things like that is it's never the same. It's always some new irritant. And, and you think it ought to be rational and it isn't rational and so on. So you never quite get prepared for the thing you're going to encounter next. But yeah, I think you can deal with anger even however deeply habitual it is if you really want to do that. Look at Mandela, because we know, his whole corpus tells us that he was an extremely angry person. The young boxer, but he wasn't just a boxer, but he was very angry. And boxing was an outlet for feelings of anger that he actually had. And it took him a very long time under very, very terrible conditions. So, it's not likely that all of us will be able to do that, but we have to try, I think.
Okay, so let's thank again Professor Niels Bohr. Yeah, so on behalf of City University, we have a small gift for you.
Oh, lovely. Oh, this is lovely. Thank you. It's this. Yes, I'm going to show the photographer. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very nice talk.
Thank you.
Okay.